the vineyards of the Medoc, north of Bordeaux on the banks of the Gironde. This landscape has little of the charm or variety to be found in other great wine areas of France. It's featureless and formed from gravels washed down by the rivers, but it's precisely this, the coarse, highly mineralized soil, which contributes to the character of the clarets of the Medoc. Before the Irish arrived, the Dutch had tamed and drained the area. Water from the land was channeled into ditches known locally as jalles, and the network of these formalized the landscape by bounding the communes, a kind of Gallic version of an Irish townland or parish. The jalles empty into the Gironde, often at the small ports used to load the wine casks for their voyage upstream to the merchants on the Quai de Chartrons in Bordeaux. The port at Béchevel in the commune of Saint-Julien is classic. A straight path from the chateau and its outbuilding, its shay, down which oxen or mules dragged the casks of claret for rolling down the mud banks and loading onto the Bordeaux-bound barges. The drained, reclaimed land was ideal for the right local formula of mixed farming. 1/3 fodder crops for the draft animals, 1/3 vine growing for wine, and 1/3 woodland to produce timber stakes to support the vines. The best wines come from undernourished grapes. Vine roots grow deep into these unpromising gravels, picking up moisture and trace elements. The pebbles heat up quickly in the morning and cool slowly in the evening, and this is good for ripening. Vines must see the river, is an old Medoc saying, and the best vineyards seem to share this characteristic, gently sloping eastwards and catching the morning sun. The climate of Bordeaux is moderated by the sea, but each vineyard has its own individual microclimate with shaded corners or foggy hollows subtly modifying the quality of the grapes. The best vineyards in the Medoc are concentrated in a relatively small area, 10 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers long, with villages punctuating the featureless agricultural landscape. The villages lack some of the character usually associated with this kind of French settlement, but there was only a track through the Medoc until the 19th century, and medieval communities tended to gather along the river bank close to their main means of communication. In style and architecture, these little service villages are far removed from the grandeur, indeed the flamboyance, of the other feature of the Medoc landscape, the chateau. Chateau with grace like Latour. The elegant Chateau Lafitte Rothschild. A Johnson connection, Chateau Lascombe. The modest McCarthy residence, once the focus for huge estates. Chateau of all styles and none, and chateau concocted from exotic architecture and imported stone. At some time, nearly 50 chateaux were connected with the Irish, who'd arrived in 18th century Bordeaux, the center of the claret trade. Nowadays, the dynasty founded by Tom Barton is the only Irish family that's been in continuous occupation of the same chateau in the Medoc since the early days. Tom Barton was born of Fermanagh farming stock in 1695 on the wooded northern shores of Lough Erne, just on the Donegal boundary. The Barton home was the Waterfoot, an unpretentious farmhouse now owned by the Barton Lone family. Inside, wine iconography is everywhere. The linked crests of the Bartons and the Johnson family in plasterwork, and the grape motives executed after the Bartons were established successfully in Bordeaux and had expanded to acquire their first wine estate at Saint-Estèphe, far downriver in the Medoc, Chateau Le Bosc. By the time French Tom, as he was called, had died, he'd amassed a huge fortune and had many estates in France and Ireland. But it was his grandson and partner, Hugh, who made the most astute acquisition with the beautiful Chateau Langlois and part of the adjoining estate of Lairville. Langlois and Lairville Barton are now the property of Anthony Barton, one of the most progressive and successful winemakers of the locality, and himself born in Straffan House in County Kildare.
I think the Irish have always been inclined, sadly, to leave their native land anyway. They had big families, I mean, our family was certainly, I think, 5 in that generation. So maybe French Tom was the first who came to this part of the world. And he probably didn't have very much to do in Ireland. I don't think he came to Bordeaux with the set intent of setting himself up as a wine merchant. I think he came possibly for general trading, and it ended up being wine. And he based his life here. The family fortune certainly fluctuated enormously. Thomas's son was William. He, I don't think, was very hard-working, and I think he appreciated the product more than he did hard work. But fortunately for us, his son Hugh was the one who really put the family back on the map. He actually wrote every year to his wife, estimating what his wealth was, and in 1845 or something like that, he estimated it £650,000, which is a lot of money in those days, a big fortune. But it wasn't all in this property or even in the properties in Ireland. As far as I remember, the Strafford house was about 60, 70,000 pounds. This was estimated about 40 or 50. So he had a lot of investments elsewhere. And we think he was involved in a lot of other commercial activities. But wine was obviously his main interest. Strange enough, he got into difficulties during the Revolution.
And difficulties is something of a euphemism. Hugh was thrown into prison. Local folklore has it that he escaped dressed as a woman, taking the key of the guillotine with him. However he escaped, Hugh did what any Irishman might do in the circumstances. He went home to his mother, the beautiful Grace Massey, at the family Tipperary estate, the Grove, a few miles from Feathered, below Slievenamon. It was during this absence from France that a remarkable friendship developed, which was to transform itself into one of the most respected business names in the wine world, B&G. The friendship was between the Irish Bartons and the French Gettiers. This most remarkable relationship is traced by Gettier descendant Guy Schieler.
My great-great-great-great-grandfather was Daniel Gettier, who came from Brittany and bought property in Saint-Onge, close to Bordeaux, and he was a sailor. He went through his different degrees, became a captain with his own ships, and he also had ships who sailed to India, where they used to bring back to Bordeaux sugar, indigo, and all kind of things like those. And he made a lot of money doing this job until he bought Chateau Bataillé. That was a wine property, and he ran Bataillé very well, made a lot of money, and was extremely wealthy. He bought also part of the Pavé de Chartron. That was part of the Chateau Trompette, a fort built by one of the French kings to avoid British invasions. During the French Revolution, Barton had to quit the country, and Daniel Gettier took care of all Barton's businesses. And Barton was absolutely quiet because he had entire confidence in Daniel Gettier, and he knew very well that after the war would be ended, that Daniel Gettier and himself would get to an official agreement, and they both would start interesting business where the wine trade is concerned. I think it's interesting to emphasize the fantastic friendship between the Bartons, the Gettiers, and the Johnstons, especially the Barton and the Gettiers, as Anthony Barton still lives in Chateau Langlois, that was bought by French Tom. I still live in the house that was bought by Daniel Gettier in Bordeaux. During the French Revolution, Gettier handled all the business, all Barton's business and his own, and during World War II, another Daniel Gettier handled all the Barton and Gettier business on behalf of Ronald Barton, who was with the Free French in Africa.
My uncle Ronald Barton inherited from his father in 1929. He had already been living here for 5 years at that stage. And I think in the early days, he was much more occupied in the running of Barton Gettier, for the simple reason that was a much more profitable end of the business than running a vineyard. But sadly, I mean, during the 1930s, there were only 2 acceptable vintages. There was big economic upheaval, particularly in France, and the big devaluation of the franc. At about the time one of the good vintages appeared on the market was the 1934. So even that, I don't think, actually brought in much money. So I think it'd be fair to say that he hung on to the property because he loved it and because he respected the tradition whereby the family was still here. But Barton-Guettier was his main activity. He had to leave Bordeaux in 1940 when the occupying forces arrived. And he came back here not knowing quite what sort of state he was going to find the property. It was very neglected, but possibly not as bad as some people might have thought. For example, the house was occupied by the Germans, and although obviously army hobnail boots didn't exactly improve the parquet floor, there was no willful damage done, and there was no question of throwing chairs out of the window or burning the Louis XV furniture. So from that point of view, we were very lucky. We obviously made wine during the war and packed some very good vintages, or very acceptable vintages. I mean, 1943 and 44 were very good, and of course there was a vintage I often refer to as the miracle of 1945. Although it was obviously harvested after the end of the war, it was almost born during the war years and suffering from the effects of all those years of occupation. And yet it was one of the best wines that's been made here or anywhere in the Medoc for a long, long, long time. Just after the war, Ronnie took a rather different path to many other proprietors who decided the best way was to make a clean sweep, pulled up what remains of the vines and replant. He always believed, quite rightly so, that the old vines produced the best wine. So he preserved as many as he could of the old vines and just replaced the ones that had died out with younger vines. And those vintages produced here immediately after the war were some of the best Lévy Barton that were ever made: 45, 47, 48, 49, 50, 52, 53. Fantastic wines.
By the 50s, B&G dominated the North American market, and Ronald Barton and Danny Guettier sold a half interest, and eventually the company passed out of their control. The historic property and the Pavé de Chartrand were vacated. All the activities of B&G have now been concentrated in a new depot at Blanfort. Not as romantic as the Pavé de Chartrand, perhaps, but more cost-effective, certainly. Neither family is involved here now, and all the Barton wine activities are conducted from Langlois. The male Guettier line expired with the death of Danny in an accident. The other half of this partnership, Ronald Barton, died quietly in the gardens of his beloved Langlois in 1986. Anthony Barton, like his uncle Ronald before him, views his ownership of Chateau Langlois as a kind of trusteeship. With the exception of the Rothschilds, no other family has held continuous ownership of a Medoc wine property for so long. 3 generations tends to be the limit, and the fact that the family is an Irish one lends added pride to the achievement. Before taking over the properties, Anthony was a negociant, a wine merchant, with his own business. This is now run by his daughter Lillian, who also participates in the complex range of deliberations and tasks associated with growing the vine and making and marketing the wine. Like any farm enterprise, wine growing is a relentless cycle of activity in preparation for the harvest. Early in the year, there's ploughing and scuffling. Vines are pruned and the spurs carefully trained. Throughout the growth period, there are pests and diseases, and it takes an array of specifics and weird machinery to cope with all the grubs and worms and moths, moles, mildews, rots, and other afflictions. With such a sensitive crop and so many hazards to overcome, the verdant, full-fruited harvest is a miracle. In Langlois Barton, 70% of the harvest is Cabernet Sauvignon, imparting good aging qualities, tannin, and aromas to the wine. 15% of the grapes are high-yielding, soft-skinned Merlot, prone to rot but adding delicacy. The balance of the crop is Cabernet Franc, which brings clarity of color and a beautiful bouquet, and Petit Verdot, a dark, thick-skinned grape which ripens slowly and imparts body and a peppery, spicy taste to the blend. Suddenly, it's harvest time, the vendange. Buses rumble through the dawn, bringing pickers to begin their back-breaking work. All the picking at Barton's is done by hand. A machine can do the work of 50 pickers, and it's a very difficult job to assemble a sizable team at a moment's notice. In the heat of the September sunshine, experienced pickers select the bunches which are just right. While machines are not so discerning, Anthony Barton believes it's only a matter of time before their use is universal. The vendange is a tense time for proprietors. Anything can go wrong.
Obviously, the closer you get to the harvest time, the more anxious one gets. And this particular year is very much a case in question, because as time progressed, we realized we had the potential of making one of the best vintages of many, many years. It can all be ruined in a very short space of time, a big hailstorm or even a lot of rain. And this has been known in the past. In 1976, for example, we had a lot of rain that ruined what was potentially a great vintage. This year, we are all set to make a great, great harvest. I'm convinced of that. It's a combination, obviously, of the weather pattern we've had throughout the season. The flowering went well, and we had the right amount of rain at the right time, and we've got a lovely sunny period now. It's almost as though the good God answered our prayers, but we haven't finished picking yet.
Noontime and relief from stooping and sweating for the pickers. A noisy camaraderie and the raucousness of an outing breaks out as the bus wends its way to Chateau Langlois for the lunch break. The Bartons have had more or less the same group of pickers coming every year for the last 30 years. Most of them live within a radius of 15 kilometers or so, and as the older pickers give up, youngsters automatically pick up the vacant places. A relaxing lunchtime is an important feature of the day. A reputation for good supplies of refreshing drinks, together with food of excellent quality and variety, has become an important element in recruiting the Bartons' loyal army of pickers at Langlois. As well as the lunchtime repast, pickers are given a dinner to take home in the evening to sustain them after a tough day stooping in the vineyards, toting the heavy panniers, or processing the picked grapes.
When we pick the grapes, we've got a somewhat different system now to what used to happen in the past. We're more conscious of the fact that the grapes should be brought whole into the cellars, where the process of crushing and so on and so forth takes place. In the old days, I mean, not so many years ago, I mean, like up to 15 years ago, people still treaded the grapes outside. They stood in these big barrels and trod on the grapes and squashed them down. We then discovered this started the process of oxidization, which we reckon is wrong. So we now pick the grapes and we put them as carefully as possible into these trailers which we have behind the tractors. They're then brought into the chai, and they go through a machine which separates the grapes from the stalks. That again is a process which has been perfected in the last few years, and there's less contact with the stalks, and the stalks can obviously give a certain flavor to the wine. And you may have heard people talking about a stalky wine. The grapes are then pumped more or less whole into the vats. The fermentation starts normally after a day or a day and a half, and here it lasts about 4 or 5 days. According to the year, it depends very much on the temperature. We still have wooden vats, and sometimes they're criticized for being more difficult to control the temperature, but in fact this is no longer so, because we can be pumping the wine, which we do anyway, over the skins, and during this process they go through a machine which is a heat exchanger, and that brings the temperature down. So there's no problem about controlling temperature. They ferment, as I say, 4 or 5 days, but they're left in contact with the skins quite a long time after the fermentations come to an end, because there's still a certain amount of extraction that takes place. They're drawing color and tannins and so on from the skins. And this is what makes a great wine. decision how long to leave them in contact with the skins and how soon to draw them off. And this is where the art of making wine comes into its strength.
The second fermentation takes place mostly in new casks, and then it's the task of the proprietor and his close colleagues to assemble the wine. Racked from cask to cask and clarified using egg white, the wine is bottled during the second year following the harvest. Chateau Langlois is at its best after 10 to 25 years, Léoville a little longer, and Barton's second wine, Lady Langlois, is for drinking young. But what qualities does Anthony suggest we should look for?
When you're looking at a wine, the first thing is to look at the color. It's a 1985 Léoville Barton, so it's a wine that's only been in bottle for about 2 years now. It's beginning to get a nice color on it. It's very bright, hardly thrown any deposit at this stage. 1985 was a comparatively light year, so it's not very, very dark in color. The next thing in the tasting process is to swirl the wine round in the glass. This gets more wine to appreciate the nose, or bouquet, as we call it. Again, this is something that develops a lot after the wine has been in bottle. This being a young wine, it hasn't got quite the aromas that it will have later on. It's beginning to show a lovely fruity nose on it. The next thing is to take a little sip. And we usually spit it out when we're tasting young wines, because sometimes we may have 20 or 30 wines. We don't want to drink it all. These Medoc wines, when they're young, they're quite sharp to the palate, especially when you're tasting them like this without food. I think it's very important to remember that wines are basically made for consuming with food. And so the slight sharpness you would get at this stage in proceedings is perfectly natural. And I think this is going to develop into a lovely wine. One of the things I like very much about it is that it has what I call elegance or finesse, and I think it's going to turn out to be a lovely vintage.
And no doubt, lovely it will be. Through careful husbandry, progressive research and development, and image building, the Barton vintages are held in high esteem. Anthony Barton has built on the enthusiasm, professionalism, and the commitment to quality re-established by his celebrated and fondly remembered Uncle Ronald. And the Irish connection with the Medoc's oldest family-owned estates will continue. Lillian Barton Sartorius' children, Melanie and Damien, are Irish citizens. And the Irish links are recorded in family archives showing connections with Fermanagh, Tipperary, Donegal, Straffan, and Coote Hall in County Roscommon. Coote Hall and the other properties in Ireland were amassed by French Tom and his grandson, the successful Hugh. In 1845, he was able to value his French and Irish assets at more than £656,000. Coote Hall was worth a substantial £74,000, the French properties a modest £40,000, and Straffan £110,000. Little remains of the old Coote Hall, but Anthony Barton's birthplace, Straffan, will soon emerge as the Smurfit organisation's Kildare Hotel and Country Club, no doubt stocking Barton and other fine growths from Bordeaux, and perhaps sampling the Bordelais cuisine in which Micheline Lawton specialises.
Smell is terrible, it's terrific. It's lamprey, something that you may not know. Because lamprey, it's a very, very old fish, if you may say. It was known in the oldest days, at the time of the Romans, as far as that. It's a big eel. It's not exactly the same family as the eel. It can be very, very long as that. It's very fat, much fatter than an eel. It can be as big as that, with a very ugly mouth. And it's a parasite. It sticks to other fish and goes up the river, eating out the fish they have been sticking onto. Well, how is it cooked? Already at the time of the Romans, they were saying that lamprey should be made with Bordeaux red wines. So you have to bleed off this big eel, the lamprey. You keep the blood, of course, and you make a very good courbouillon with lots of good things. Wine, red wine, and a strong red wine. And the best is the wine, the best is going to be the dish. And you add onions and lots of things, and carrots, and bones of fish, all kinds of things who are going to do a very good taste. And then you cook it as a civet of a rabbit or something like that. And you may cook it for several days, it's even better. 3 hours the first day, then the next day 2 hours more, and the next day 1 hour more. And it comes out like that. And you put a lot of leek in the sauce to cook it, and this is very special. You need the leek to have with lamprey a very good taste. Then wine, as I told you, the best is the wine, the best is the dish. Today we have a Saint-Estèphe. Félan Ségur, we say in French, and you say Phelan. Of course, it's an Irish family. It's a very good Saint-Estèphe, one of the best. If you don't want to put as much money in your dish, you can use a less sophisticated wine, as Chateau Dillon, also an Irish name, and the dish is going to be very good too. You cannot eat it every day, but in Bordeaux, they love it. And I knew a very old man who used to say, lamprey, I believe in my life. I've been eating miles and miles of lamprey. Let's try if you come to Bordeaux.
Lamprey may not be your first choice, but the clarets with an Irish connection I can certainly vouch for. Most, like Barton's, bearing a label with the distinctive coat of arms of a Wine Geese family.